Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about the Tesla story without the lightning bolts. Not the dramatic version with thunder cracking across the sky while a lone genius raises his arms toward destiny. Not the version where electricity dances obediently around him like a loyal pet. No, we're going to sit quietly with the paperwork, the unpaid bills, the long walks home, and the slow, slightly awkward rhythm of a man who spent more time thinking than being applauded. And before we dim the lights completely, just a small reminder. If you enjoy this kind of slow, uneventful historical drifting, you can quietly subscribe. No fireworks required. Nikola Tesla was not born in a laboratory surrounded by sparks. He was born in 1856 in a small village in what is now Croatia, then part of the Austrian Empire. His father was a priest. His mother managed the household and, interestingly, invented small mechanical tools to make daily life easier. So from the beginning, Tesla's world was less mad scientist and more modest rural routine. There were no dramatic orchestral swells. Mostly, there were chores. As a child, Tesla had a strong imagination. He also had an excellent memory. This sounds impressive, and it was, but it mostly meant he could visualize machines very clearly in his head and recall entire books word for word, which is useful, but not exactly cinematic. Instead of building gadgets explosively in barns, he preferred to construct them mentally, rotating components in his mind until they behaved properly. It was engineering, but very quiet engineering, the kind you could do while staring out a window for an uncomfortably long time. He studied engineering in Graz and later attended university in Prague, though he never completed a formal degree. Financial trouble followed him the way background music follows a suspense scene, persistent, low, and slightly stressful. He gambled away his scholarship money at one point, not in a glamorous Monte Carlo kind of way, more in a student making poor decisions under dim lighting kind of way. It was less mythic downfall and more ordinary human error. When Tesla moved to the United States in 1884, he arrived with a letter of recommendation to Thomas Edison. This is often framed as the beginning of an epic rivalry. In reality, it began with a job. Tesla worked for Edison's company fixing electrical equipment. He was diligent. He worked long hours. He proposed improvements. At one point, he believed Edison had promised him a large bonus for redesigning certain generators. When the bonus did not materialize, Tesla resigned. The disagreement was not accompanied by thunderclaps. It was mostly frustration and disappointment, and possibly a very long walk home. After leaving Edison, Tesla experienced something profoundly unglamorous: unemployment. He dug ditches for a time. The image of a future icon of electrical innovation performing manual labor in muddy conditions is not usually highlighted in documentaries. But there he was. No glowing coils, just dirt. Eventually, investors backed Tesla's work on alternating current systems. This led to what historians call the War of Currents, a battle between direct current and alternating current systems. It sounds dramatic. In practice, it involved business strategies, public demonstrations, marketing campaigns, and arguments about infrastructure efficiency. There were demonstrations involving animals, which were unpleasant and controversial, but the broader struggle was largely corporate and technical. Contracts were signed, patents were filed, lawsuits happened, meetings were held. Many meetings. Tesla's alternating current system ultimately proved more efficient for long-distance power transmission. It was used at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair and later at Niagara Falls. These were triumphs, yes, but even triumphs involve planning committees, budgets, equipment failures, and tense correspondence. Success rarely arrives as a lightning strike. It arrives as a stack of documents. Later in life, Tesla became increasingly isolated. He developed strong personal routines. He avoided germs obsessively. He formed an attachment to pigeons in New York City, feeding them daily. The newspapers found this eccentric. Tesla likely found it comforting. His grandest ideas, wireless power transmission towers, global communication networks, struggled financially. Investors preferred reliable returns over visionary sketches. The Wardenclyffe Tower project eventually collapsed under debt. The tower was dismantled. There was no dramatic explosion, just quiet dismantling. By the time Tesla died in 1943, alone in a New York hotel room, he was respected by some, forgotten by many, and financially strained. His story did not end with a glowing laboratory. It ended with paperwork handled by others and a modest funeral. And that, perhaps, is the version rarely told. Not because it's scandalous, but because it's slow. It's about persistence, disappointment, occasional success, and long stretches of obscurity. It's about a man who imagined the future in extraordinary detail, while living a life that, day to day, was mostly ordinary. And as we settle into this quieter version, we'll continue slowly, without the lightning. If we continue gently forward, without summoning thunder for dramatic effect, we arrive at a phase of Tesla's life that is often described as brilliant, which it was. But it was also repetitive and lonely, and filled with the sort of administrative friction that tends to drain even the most visionary minds. After his success with alternating current systems, Tesla became something of a celebrity in certain technical circles. He gave lectures. He demonstrated devices that produced high-frequency currents and glowing tubes of light. Audiences were impressed. Newspapers used words like wizard and magician. Tesla himself preferred precision over mysticism, but he did not entirely object to the mystique. It helped attract funding, and funding, as he was painfully aware, was oxygen. His laboratory experiments in the 1890s were visually dramatic. Coils, sparks, arcs of electricity stretching across darkened rooms. But behind every theatrical demonstration was an exhausting sequence of calibrations, calculations, rewiring, and small failures. The public saw seconds of spectacle. Tesla experienced weeks of troubleshooting. He developed what we now call the Tesla coil, a device capable of producing very high voltages at low current. It remains a fascinating piece of engineering, but building and refining it did not feel like a montage. It felt like trial and error. Adjust, test, burn a component, replace it, adjust again, repeat. Then there was Colorado Springs in 1899. Tesla moved there to conduct large-scale experiments on wireless transmission. This is often portrayed as the height of his dramatic phase. Lightning bolts bursting from a laboratory in the middle of the plains. And yes, there were enormous electrical discharges. But there were also invoices, rental agreements, equipment shipping delays, repairs after accidental overloads that knocked out local power systems. At one point, Tesla reportedly generated artificial lightning, measuring tens of meters long. The press loved it. The neighbors were less enthusiastic. Power failures are rarely appreciated, even when caused by genius. It was in Colorado that Tesla became deeply convinced he could transmit power wirelessly across vast distances, not just signals, actual usable electricity. He believed the Earth itself could conduct energy efficiently. This belief led him to his most ambitious and ultimately most disappointing project, Wardenclyffe Tower. Back in New York, with financial backing from J.P. Morgan, Tesla began constructing a massive tower on Long Island. Officially, it was intended for wireless communication. Unofficially, Tesla hoped it would become a global system for transmitting both information and energy, a kind of early vision of a connected planet. It was bold, it was expensive, it was unfinished. As construction dragged on, costs rose. Investors became uneasy. Marconi, working on wireless telegraphy, achieved successful transatlantic communication first. It was a practical victory. Tesla's broader vision, though perhaps ahead of its time, did not produce immediate returns. Morgan withdrew support. And here we encounter something deeply human, the slow erosion of backing, not a dramatic betrayal, not a villain twirling a mustache, simply the quiet withdrawal of financial confidence. The tower stood incomplete. Funding dried up. The dream contracted. Tesla continued to propose ideas, remote-controlled devices, advanced turbines, directed energy concepts, but fewer investors listened with the same enthusiasm. The early 20th century favored scalable industrial systems. Tesla favored sweeping transformations. These are not always compatible. As his income declined, Tesla's living arrangements became more modest. He moved between hotels, sometimes leaving behind unpaid bills that were discreetly settled by friends or supporters. His routines became stricter. He reportedly insisted on using precisely 18 napkins at dinner. He calculated the cubic volume of food before eating it. He avoided shaking hands to reduce exposure to germs. Eccentricity, when paired with fame, is called charm. Eccentricity without steady income becomes something else, something quieter. Meanwhile, the electrical world continued to expand. Power grids, appliances, radio technology, many built upon principles Tesla had advanced. But the infrastructure of modern life does not pause to acknowledge its architects daily. It simply functions. By the 1920s and 1930s, Tesla was giving interviews filled with grand predictions: death rays, advanced communication systems, energy breakthroughs. Some ideas were plausible extensions of his earlier work. Others were more speculative. The press alternated between fascination and skepticism. The public moved on to newer figures, newer technologies. And so we find Tesla in later life, walking slowly through New York streets, feeding pigeons, thinking about systems that spanned the globe. His mind remained expansive. His circumstances did not. There is no lightning here, only a gradual dimming of attention, a shift from celebrated inventor to eccentric relic. It is not dramatic enough for cinema, but it is, in its own way, deeply instructive. Because history, when stripped of special effects, often reveals something more ordinary than legend. It reveals long stretches of effort, interrupted funding, delayed recognition, and occasionally a quiet man in a hotel room imagining currents still moving through the earth. If we move even more slowly now, we reach the part of Tesla's life that biographies often skim past with polite efficiency. The years where nothing explodes, nothing is unveiled, nothing quite works the way it used to. By the 1930s, the world had changed. Radios filled homes, automobiles crowded streets, electric grids expanded with steady practicality. Many of these developments rested, at least partially, on foundations Tesla had helped establish. Alternating current systems hummed quietly across continents. Motors turned, generators spun, cities glowed at night, and yet Tesla himself did not glow. He lived primarily in New York hotels, negotiating arrangements with management who were sometimes patient and sometimes not. Bills accumulated, admirers occasionally intervened. There is something deeply uncinematic about unpaid hotel invoices. They lack the romance of dramatic failure. They simply arrive, are reviewed, and remain unresolved. Tesla's routines grew more rigid with age. He preferred specific rooms, specific numbers, specific sequences of action. He walked the same paths. He ate carefully measured meals. He maintained an almost ceremonial cleanliness. These habits likely offered structure in a life where external stability had faded. The pigeons became central. He fed them daily in Bryant Park. He claimed to love one white pigeon in particular, describing her in language usually reserved for deep companionship. It is easy to smile gently at this detail, but if you sit with it long enough, it feels less eccentric and more solitary. The city moved around him, traffic roared, businesses opened and closed, and Tesla, once hailed as a wizard of electricity, quietly fed birds. In interviews during these years, he spoke of new inventions, a teleforce weapon that could end war by making it too devastating to attempt. The press labeled it a death ray. The term stuck because it sounded dramatic. But behind the phrase was an aging inventor still trying to secure backing for ideas that required significant funding. The proposals were detailed. The blueprints existed. The investment did not. It is important to understand that Tesla was not universally dismissed. He received honors late in life. He was invited to celebrations marking his birthdays. Engineers respected his earlier work. But recognition does not necessarily restore momentum. It does not rebuild towers that were dismantled. It does not reopen laboratories that closed decades earlier. When he turned 75 in 1931, Time magazine featured him on its cover. The image was dignified, the caption respectful. It was, in many ways, a pleasant acknowledgment, but it was also retrospective, a celebration of what had been accomplished, not what was currently unfolding. And so, Tesla lived within a curious tension, architect of the electrical age, yet financially precarious, globally known, yet personally isolated, visionary of vast networks, yet confined to a hotel suite. When he died in January 1943, in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel, it was quiet. A maid discovered him after he had placed a "Do Not Disturb" sign on his door for several days. There was no final experiment crackling in the background, no dramatic speech, just stillness. After his death, the U.S. government briefly examined his papers, concerned about possible military applications of his later ideas. Most documents were eventually returned to his family. The legend began to expand in the years that followed. Popular culture rediscovered him. Conspiracy theories wrapped themselves around fragments of his work. The lightning returned, metaphorically at least. But if we remove that glow again, carefully, what remains is something quieter and perhaps more relatable. A man of extraordinary intellectual capacity navigating an ordinary human landscape, funding shortages, professional rivalry, miscalculations, shifting public interest, aging, loneliness. He was neither purely tragic nor constantly triumphant. He was persistent, sometimes brilliant, sometimes impractical, often misunderstood, frequently short on cash. The boring Tesla story is not an insult. It is an adjustment. It replaces spectacle with process. It exchanges myth for minutes. The minutes spent recalculating voltages, rewriting proposals, waiting for investors, walking through the city, feeding pigeons, staring out windows, while imagining systems that stretched across oceans. Electricity itself is mostly invisible. It moves quietly through wires, unnoticed until it stops. Perhaps it is fitting that the life of one of its great pioneers followed a similar pattern, a steady current of effort, occasional flashes, long stretches of dim light, and if we sit here for a moment longer, in the calm after the lightning has faded, we can almost hear it. Not a thunderclap, but a soft, continuous hum. And now, if we let the hum continue just a little longer, we arrive at the part of Tesla's story that tends to be reconstructed after the fact, the rehabilitation, the slow reassembly of reputation, the careful polishing of memory. Because here is something history does quite often: it simplifies. In the decades after Tesla's death, technology accelerated dramatically. Electronics shrank. Computers emerged. Satellites orbited the planet. Wireless communication became ordinary. The world began to resemble, in certain abstract ways, the interconnected future Tesla had once described in interviews that few had taken seriously at the time. And so people looked backward. They rediscovered his patents. They re-examined his lectures. They noticed how many foundational systems of the electrical age bore his fingerprints: alternating current, induction motors, high-frequency experimentation. Suddenly, the quiet engineer who had died alone in a hotel room began to look like a prophet. But prophecy, when examined calmly, often turns out to be pattern recognition combined with persistence. Tesla did not predict the smartphone exactly. He predicted wireless communication networks capable of transmitting information across vast distances. That is not mysticism, it is extrapolation, a careful extension of what he already understood about resonance and signal transmission. He did not conjure electricity from thin air. He refined systems, improved efficiency, designed components that solve practical problems in scalable ways. The myth prefers lightning bolts because lightning is dramatic. The reality prefers schematics because schematics are useful. The so-called war of currents became a morality play in popular retellings. Edison the villain, Tesla the misunderstood hero. But actual industrial competition is rarely that tidy. Edison was a complex industrialist. Tesla was a complex inventor. Both operated within a rapidly expanding technological marketplace. They disagreed. They competed. They made strategic choices. There were no capes involved. As the 20th century progressed, Tesla's name slowly detached from obscurity and attached itself to innovation mythology. Science fiction writers invoked him. Engineers admired him. Later, an electric car company would take his name, further cementing his association with forward-thinking energy systems. His image, tall, angular, intense, became shorthand for solitary genius. But when you peel away the stylization, you still find the same daily rhythm: calculations, negotiations, failed funding rounds, revised prototypes, stubborn optimism. Perhaps what makes the boring version of Tesla so compelling is precisely that it is not supernatural. It is procedural. He did not change the world in a single thunderous event. He changed it in increments, through persistent refinement, through systems thinking, through technical patience. And if you look at his life without the lightning, what you see is something deeply instructive for anyone who has ever worked on a long, complicated project. Perhaps one that requires funding proposals, strategic pivots, technical validation, and the occasional uncomfortable setback. Vision alone is not enough. Execution matters. Timing matters. Capital matters. Public perception matters. Even the most elegant idea can sit idle without the infrastructure to support it. Tesla's tragedy, if we want to use such a heavy word gently, was not that he lacked brilliance. It was that brilliance does not guarantee sustainability. Markets reward certain kinds of innovation at certain moments. Others wait. He often operated slightly ahead of his financial runway, and yet the alternating current systems he championed became the backbone of modern power distribution. They are still there, invisible, reliable, humming behind walls. If you sit in a quiet room at night and hear the faint electrical buzz from a distant appliance, you are hearing the legacy of countless engineers, Tesla among them, who made decisions about frequency, phase, and efficiency more than a century ago. No lightning required. So when we talk about the Tesla story without the lightning bolts, what we are really doing is trading spectacle for continuity. We are choosing to see him not as a misunderstood wizard abandoned by a dramatic world, but as a highly intelligent, occasionally impractical, persistently driven engineer navigating the same constraints that govern innovation today. Budgets, competition, skepticism, aging, and the quiet hope that the next idea will hold. History prefers noise, but progress is often quiet, and somewhere in that steady hum of alternating current, there is a reminder that the world is changed less by single flashes of brilliance, and more by systems that keep running long after the sparks fade. If we lower the volume even further, almost to a whisper, we can examine one final, slightly uncomfortable truth about Tesla's life. It was not only shaped by brilliance and bad timing, it was also shaped by personality. Tesla was intensely focused, which sounds admirable, and it was. But intense focus can become isolation if left unchecked. He preferred working alone. He trusted his mental simulations over collaborative tinkering. He disliked compromise. Investors, on the other hand, tend to prefer collaboration, progress reports, and timelines that do not drift toward infinity. There is a quiet pattern in his career: extraordinary idea, initial enthusiasm, rising cost, delayed completion, withdrawn funding. Not because the ideas were foolish. Often they were simply too large, too early, or too loosely tied to immediate commercial outcomes. Wardenclyffe Tower is the clearest example. It was visionary, it was ambitious. It was also financially unsustainable without a clear short-term return. Investors are not villains for wanting returns. They are investors. Tesla often spoke in sweeping planetary terms: free energy, global communication, universal access. These are noble concepts. They are also structurally expensive. Meanwhile, other inventors were building systems that solved narrower problems, more incremental improvements, more defined markets. The world tends to reward incremental scalability more reliably than grand leaps. This is not a moral judgment. It is an observation. In his later interviews, Tesla sometimes described future technologies with great confidence: machines that would eliminate war, devices that would transmit images across the globe, systems that would automate labor. Many of these ideas were not impossible. They were simply beyond the manufacturing and economic ecosystem of his time. It is easy to romanticize being ahead of your time. It is less comfortable to live there. And yet, despite financial strain and diminishing institutional support, Tesla never stopped thinking. That might be the least dramatic and most important part of his story. He did not retire into bitterness. He continued sketching, calculating, proposing. Even when newspapers treated him as a curiosity, he persisted in refining concepts. There is something deeply human about that persistence, not the lightning, not the coils, not the staged photographs of electrical arcs wrapping around his body like theatrical props, but the quiet act of continuing to imagine. When he died in 1943, the world was at war. Radar systems, radio networks, and electrical infrastructure were playing enormous roles in modern conflict. Tesla's early work on high-frequency currents and wireless concepts had contributed indirectly to this technological landscape. He did not witness the full maturity of the electrical century he helped initiate. Few pioneers do. Innovation is usually generational. One person establishes a principle, another industrializes it, a third refines it, a fourth miniaturizes it. By the time the system becomes seamless, the originator is often a footnote, unless, of course, myth intervenes. And myth did intervene for Tesla. He became a symbol of overlooked genius, a patron saint of misunderstood inventors, a convenient counter-narrative to industrial titans, a reminder that recognition and contribution are not always synchronized. But if we are honest, gently honest, the boring Tesla story might be the most empowering version, because it suggests that progress is built from persistence under constraint, that brilliance can coexist with flawed decisions, that recognition may arrive late or unevenly or not at all, and yet the work still matters. Tesla's life was not a constant thunderstorm of inspiration. It was a steady current of thought, occasionally interrupted by sparks, frequently limited by finances, sometimes hindered by personality, and ultimately woven into the infrastructure of modern life. So the next time you hear his name paired with lightning, you might imagine instead a quieter image. A tall man in a dim hotel room, surrounded not by arcs of electricity, but by papers, diagrams, calculations, ideas still forming. No applause, no thunder, just the soft, persistent hum of someone who believed the world could be wired differently and kept trying, even when the room grew silent. And if we stay with that dim hotel room for just a little longer, we begin to notice something almost reassuring about it. Because stripped of spectacle, Tesla's life becomes less of a myth and more of a pattern that repeats quietly across history. A young mind filled with possibility, an early breakthrough, a period of recognition, an ambitious expansion, a financial strain, a gradual retreat from the spotlight. Not tragic in the operatic sense, not triumphant in the cinematic sense, just human. There is a tendency to assume that genius must feel electrifying from the inside, that it must crackle, that it must burn brightly at all times. But if Tesla's daily life tells us anything, it is that even extraordinary minds spend most of their hours in ordinary ways. He woke up. He dressed carefully. He walked. He calculated. He wrote letters asking for support. He waited for replies that sometimes never came. The mythology compresses decades into moments. The reality stretches moments into decades. Consider how long he carried certain ideas. Wireless power transmission was not a weekend project. It occupied years of thought, years of refinement, years of persuasion attempts. The disappointment of Wardenclyffe was not a sudden collapse. It was a slow constriction of possibility. And yet, even in failure, the conceptual groundwork mattered. Later generations would revisit wireless energy transfer in smaller, more practical forms. Engineers would revisit high-frequency systems. Researchers would explore resonance-based power transfer again and again. Progress does not discard old ideas. It archives them, waits for conditions to align, and quietly reopens the file. Tesla's life, when told without lightning, becomes a story about timing as much as talent. He understood alternating current at a moment when cities were expanding. That alignment produced visible success. He pursued global wireless energy at a moment when infrastructure, materials, and capital markets were not ready to support it at scale. That misalignment produced visible frustration. Same mind, different conditions. It is tempting to imagine that if Tesla had lived a few decades later, everything would have been different. Perhaps. Or perhaps he would have been early again in a different way. Visionary thinking often operates slightly ahead of consensus. That is both its strength and its vulnerability. In the end, what remains is not the dramatic rivalry, not the exaggerated conspiracy theories, not the stylized portraits with artificial lightning drawn in afterward. What remains is alternating current, still humming through power lines. What remains is the induction motor, still turning quietly in countless devices. What remains is the demonstration that systems thinking can reshape infrastructure. And perhaps most importantly, what remains is an example of sustained intellectual effort under imperfect circumstances. The boring Tesla story is not a downgrade. It is a recalibration. It reminds us that history's most transformative figures did not live inside highlight reels. They lived inside days, long ones, with budgets to balance and egos to manage and ideas to refine. If you listen closely, not for thunder, but for continuity, you can almost sense the rhythm of it, a steady oscillation, back and forth, alternating, and perhaps that is the most fitting metaphor of all. If we allow that steady oscillation to continue a little longer, we arrive at something even quieter than biography. We arrive at perspective. Because once the lightning has been removed, once the rivalries have softened, once the mythology has been gently folded and set aside, what we are left with is a question that hums softly beneath the surface. What does it actually mean to matter? Tesla did not die wealthy. He did not build a lasting industrial empire under his own name. He did not control the corporations that scaled his ideas, and yet his work persists in infrastructure so deeply embedded in daily life that it is almost invisible. Turn on a light, start a motor, charge a device. The systems behind these actions owe something to the mathematics and engineering he advanced. Not exclusively, not single-handedly, but undeniably. And this is where the boring version becomes powerful, because it suggests that influence is not always synchronized with comfort. Impact is not always synchronized with recognition. Contribution is not always synchronized with reward. Tesla's life demonstrates something subtle. Innovation is cumulative. It is rarely owned entirely by one person. It is built in layers. He improved on ideas that came before him. Others improved on his. The electrical grid was not born from a single laboratory. It was assembled through negotiation, experimentation, argument, iteration. When we frame Tesla as a lone wizard abandoned by a cruel world, we miss something important. We miss the network, the ecosystem, the reality that invention is relational. Even his so-called rivalry with Edison was less mythic duel and more industrial divergence. Different technical philosophies, different business strategies, different tolerances for risk. In the end, alternating current proved more scalable for long-distance transmission. That outcome shaped modern infrastructure, but it was not achieved through a single dramatic showdown. It emerged from testing, economics, engineering practicality, and time. Time is rarely dramatic. It simply accumulates. And perhaps that is the gentlest lesson hidden in the Tesla story without the lightning bolts. You can live a life that feels financially unstable, occasionally overlooked, sometimes misunderstood, and still contribute something foundational. You can experience long stretches where your grandest ideas stall, and still leave behind work that hums for generations. The quiet hotel room is not a contradiction of the glowing grid. It is part of the same story. Tesla's later solitude does not erase his earlier breakthroughs. His financial missteps do not invalidate his technical insight. His eccentricities do not diminish his contributions. They coexist. If anything, removing the lightning makes him more accessible, less myth, more human. A person who miscalculated, a person who overestimated investor patience, a person who remained intellectually restless, a person who kept imagining. And if we sit here in this softer version of history, we may realize something unexpectedly calming. The world is not changed only by dramatic flashes. It is changed by currents that keep flowing long after the sparks fade, and somewhere in the low, steady hum of a powered city at night, there is a trace of a tall engineer who once stared out a window and imagined electricity moving differently. No thunder, just continuity. And if we let that continuity stretch just a little further, we begin to notice something almost comforting about the entire arc of his life. Because once the myth settles, Tesla's story stops being about spectacle and starts being about endurance. He endured miscalculations. He endured skepticism. He endured the slow withdrawal of financial support. He endured watching others commercialize technologies that shared conceptual ground with his own work. And yet, he continued thinking. There is something quietly radical about that. Most of us imagine history as a sequence of dramatic turning points, a breakthrough, a rivalry, a public triumph. But Tesla's life suggests something more subdued. The turning points were often administrative: a contract signed, a contract revoked, a patent filed, a patent contested, an investor persuaded, an investor unconvinced. These are not scenes that inspire orchestral scores. They are scenes that require patience. If we examine his notebooks, we do not find lightning bolts drawn in the margins. We find diagrams, equations, careful annotations, adjustments, iterations. Iteration is not glamorous. It is repetitive by design. Tesla would visualize entire machines in his mind before building them physically. He described rotating components mentally, testing tolerances internally. This sounds extraordinary, and it was. But from the outside, it likely looked like a man standing very still for a very long time. Progress often looks like stillness. There is also the matter of scale. Tesla tended to think in planetary terms. global transmission, worldwide communication, energy distributed without wires. His mental frame was vast, but vast visions require layered execution, infrastructure, regulation, manufacturing capability, market alignment. Without those layers, the vision hovers just slightly above practical reach. He was not alone in this tension. Many innovators live in that narrow gap between possibility and feasibility. It is a quiet gap, one that does not photograph well. And yet, over time, pieces of his expansive thinking found their place. Wireless communication matured, power grids interconnected, electrical standards stabilized. The world became more networked, more synchronized, not because one tower succeeded, but because countless engineers continued refining the principles he helped articulate. The boring Tesla story does something subtle. It removes inevitability. It reminds us that nothing about his legacy was guaranteed. Alternating current could have failed commercially. Investors could have abandoned him earlier. Technical standards might have shifted differently. History feels linear in retrospect. It rarely feels that way while you're living inside it. Imagine being Tesla in 1905. Wardenclyffe stalled, funding uncertain, public attention divided, the future unclear. There was no guarantee that his name would be remembered kindly or remembered at all. And yet he kept proposing, kept calculating, kept imagining resonance and frequency and transmission. Perhaps the most instructive part of his life is not the invention itself, but the refusal to stop conceptualizing even when applause faded. When he walked through New York in later years, feeding pigeons and contemplating new designs, he was not a thunderbolt frozen in time. He was a thinker continuing to think. And that may be the most accurate metaphor of all. Electricity is not lightning. Lightning is dramatic but brief. Electricity, harnessed properly, is continuous, sustained, managed, flowing through structured pathways. Tesla's life followed that quieter pattern. A steady, intellectual current, occasional sparks, long stretches of dim rooms, and detailed diagrams. If you remove the lightning, what remains is not disappointment, it is durability. And perhaps that is more impressive than spectacle. And if we remain with that idea of durability just a little longer, something even quieter begins to surface. Tesla's life was not only about invention, it was about tolerance for ambiguity. He rarely knew in the moment which of his ideas would survive. When he developed high-frequency systems, he could not predict exactly how future engineers would adapt them. When he envisioned wireless communication, he could not foresee the specific devices that would eventually emerge. He was operating inside uncertainty and doing so calmly. Uncertainty is rarely dramatic. It is simply present. Much of his career unfolded without clear validation. There were brief periods of applause, the Chicago World's Fair, the Niagara Falls Power Project, but these were islands in a long sea of waiting, waiting for capital, waiting for materials, waiting for acceptance. Waiting is not cinematic, and yet waiting is where most innovation lives. The public imagination prefers decisive victories. A genius defeats a rival. A single idea changes everything, but infrastructure evolves gradually. Electrical systems required standards, copper supply chains, regulatory agreements, municipal approvals. None of these produce lightning in the sky. They produce reliability in the wall socket. Tesla contributed to that reliability. He understood phase relationships in alternating current. He improved motor efficiency. He demonstrated that electricity could be distributed over long distances with manageable loss. These were not theatrical achievements. They were structural ones, and structural contributions often feel underwhelming in real time. Perhaps this is why the myth grew louder later. Humans are uncomfortable with subtlety. We like heroes who glow. We prefer origin stories that spark. But if you sit quietly with the real rhythm of his life, you begin to see something more relatable than legend. He experienced optimism. He experienced overreach. He experienced correction. He experienced persistence. And through all of it, he kept refining ideas that outlived him. By the time modern cities became fully electrified networks, Tesla was no longer present to witness the scale. He did not see the skyscrapers lit effortlessly at night across continents. He did not see the global communications web crystallize into satellites and fiber optics. He helped define principles. Others scaled them. This division of labor is not unusual. It is simply less romantic. The boring Tesla story asks us to sit with that reality. To accept that contribution does not require constant spotlight. That progress is cumulative. That influence can be invisible. It also reminds us that brilliance does not immunize anyone from misjudgment. Tesla misread investor appetite more than once. He pursued projects whose scale outpaced available resources. He trusted conceptual clarity to carry financial weight. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it did not. That oscillation, success, strain, recalibration is far more common than myth suggests. And perhaps the calmest conclusion we can draw is this: the world we inhabit is powered not by lightning, but by sustained systems. Those systems were shaped by many minds. Tesla was one of them, not a deity of electricity, not a flawless prophet, but a persistent engineer with an unusually expansive imagination. If you turn off the lights now and let the room go dim, the silence is not empty. Beneath it, there is still current moving quietly through the walls, back and forth, alternating. And in that steady, nearly invisible motion, there is a trace of a man who spent much of his life in quiet rooms, thinking about how to make energy travel farther than anyone believed possible. No lightning, just continuity. And as we let that continuity carry us to the very end, there is one final adjustment to make. It is easy to turn Tesla into a cautionary tale about unrecognized genius. It is equally easy to turn him into a martyr of capitalism, or a saint of science fiction, or a misunderstood oracle whose ideas were too pure for his era. But the quiet version resists those extremes. The quiet version suggests something steadier. Tesla was extraordinarily capable in certain domains. His grasp of electromagnetic principles was advanced. His spatial visualization skills were rare. His ability to conceptualize rotating magnetic fields without physical prototypes was remarkable. He was also inconsistent in business judgment. He sometimes underestimated costs. He overestimated investor patience. He believed that technical elegance would naturally persuade financial systems. It rarely does. This does not diminish him. It rounds him. The myth removes friction. The real story restores it. And friction is where growth occurs. In machines, in markets, in minds. There is a certain irony in how his name now carries a kind of electrical glamour. His face appears on posters. His biography is retold in documentaries. His persona is woven into pop culture narratives of innovation. But if you rewind to the actual decades he lived through, Much of his time was spent not in dramatic revelation, but in patient refinement, writing letters, recalculating, sketching again, negotiating, walking alone, feeding pigeons, imagining transmission towers taller than budgets could support. It is not a thunderstorm. It is a long, steady drizzle of effort. And perhaps that is the most restful way to understand him. Because if progress depended on lightning, on singular, explosive brilliance, it would be fragile, rare, unrepeatable. But progress depends on systems, on alternating flows, on engineers who are willing to sit quietly with equations for years, on infrastructure that hums rather than flashes. Tesla's legacy is not the bolt in the sky. It is the grid beneath the city. It is not the spark. It is the sustained oscillation. When we remove the lightning, we do not remove the significance. We simply remove the noise. What remains is a man who thought deeply about how energy could move through the world, and who kept thinking about it even when applause faded, funding tightened, and attention shifted elsewhere. And that might be the most quietly inspiring part of all, because it suggests that meaningful work does not require spectacle. It requires persistence. It requires imagination. It requires tolerance for long stretches of uncertainty. And sometimes it requires the willingness to continue in a dim room long after the lightning has stopped. If you listen closely now, you can almost hear it again, not thunder, but a gentle, continuous hum, back and forth, alternating, and with that steady current, we can let the lights dim completely. No sparks, no applause, just quiet history. And even now, after the lights have dimmed and the city hums softly outside, there is still one more layer to settle into. Because once we accept that Tesla's life was not a storm but a current, we begin to notice something else. He was not trying to be legendary. There is no evidence that he woke each morning thinking, "Today I will become myth." He woke thinking about resonance, about phase alignment, about how to reduce transmission loss across distance. The mythology came later, assembled carefully by people who prefer heroes to humans. But humans are more instructive. Consider how many of his setbacks were not catastrophic failures, but accumulations. A delayed payment, a withdrawn investor, a patent dispute, a public demonstration that did not convert into immediate profit. Each event small enough on its own. Together, enough to redirect a life. History often magnifies outcomes and shrinks the process. It tells us that alternating current won and direct current lost, as if it were a championship match. In reality, both systems survived in different forms. Both adapted. Infrastructure is rarely binary. Tesla's ideas integrated into a larger electrical ecosystem. He did not own that ecosystem. He influenced it. And influence is quieter than ownership. Ownership has logos and dividends. Influence has continuity. If you look at a modern power grid diagram, you will not see Tesla's signature printed across it. You will see standards, voltage levels, transmission lines, substations, transformers, systems layered over decades. But buried inside those standards is the rotating magnetic field he conceptualized. Inside those transmission lines is the principle of alternating current he championed. Inside countless motors is the structure he refined. His presence is structural, and structure does not shout. There is something strangely calming about that realization, because it reframes success. It suggests that contribution can be embedded rather than advertised. That impact can persist even when personality fades from public memory. Tesla's later years, quiet, and financially strained are often described with a tone of melancholy. And yes, there was loneliness. There was constraint. There was disappointment. But there was also continuity of thought. He never abandoned the belief that systems could be improved, that energy could move more efficiently, that communication could transcend distance. He may have misjudged timing. He may have miscalculated resources, but he did not surrender curiosity. And perhaps curiosity, sustained over decades, is more important than spectacle. When we remove the lightning, we remove the illusion that greatness must be loud. We are left instead with a steady engineer who kept adjusting parameters long after applause diminished. And if we look carefully, that steady adjustment, that quiet recalibration, mirrors the very nature of alternating current itself. It does not move in one triumphant direction. It oscillates, it corrects, it balances, back and forth, reliable not because it flashes, but because it persists. So if tonight you think of Tesla, you might not picture a man surrounded by theatrical arcs of electricity. You might picture a desk, papers, a small lamp, careful diagrams, a window looking out onto a city that would one day run on principles he helped define. No thunder, just the soft hum of infrastructure doing exactly what it was designed to do. And in that hum, a quiet reminder that history's most powerful forces are often the least dramatic. They do not explode, they endure. And if we sit with that endurance just a little longer, something else becomes clear. Tesla's story is not simply about invention, it is about scale, and the difficulty of living inside ideas that are larger than your immediate environment. When he imagined global wireless transmission, he was thinking at planetary scale while operating within a bank account that required monthly negotiation. When he envisioned coordinated energy systems, he was working in rented rooms. There is a quiet tension in that contrast. Grand scale, limited means. This tension is not unique to him. It is a recurring pattern in the history of innovation. The mind expands faster than the infrastructure supporting it. And so much of Tesla's life was spent in that gap. He could describe systems that would allow messages to travel instantly across oceans. Yet he still needed to persuade individual investors face to face. He could imagine distributing power without wires. Yet he relied on very physical wires to secure funding. It must have been strange to think globally and negotiate locally. But this is how most transformative ideas move forward. Not as fully formed revolutions, but as partial implementations. A fair demonstration here. A hydroelectric plant there. A lecture delivered to a room of skeptics. A patent filed and defended. Progress is layered. When the Chicago World's Fair illuminated its grounds using alternating current, visitors experienced wonder. But behind that wonder were procurement lists, installation crews, engineering diagrams, coordination meetings. Tesla's ideas required collaboration to become visible. He was capable of solitary thinking, but implementation always required others. Perhaps one of the quiet ironies of his life is that the more expansive his visions became, the more dependent he was on systems he did not control. Finance, manufacturing, politics. And when those systems shifted away from him, his vision slowed. This is not villainy, it is ecosystem dynamics. By the time of his death in 1943, the world was deep into the electrical age. Radar was advancing. Telecommunications were evolving. Industrial machinery depended on motors whose conceptual foundations he had helped establish decades earlier. The age he imagined was arriving, just not through him alone. There is something humbling about that. The future rarely belongs to a single architect. It belongs to networks of refinement. Tesla was one node in that network, a significant node, certainly, but still part of a larger system. When mythology isolates him as a solitary genius betrayed by history, it simplifies the story into drama. When we view him as an engineer embedded within a web of industrial forces, economic constraints, and collaborative scaling, the story becomes quieter and more realistic. It also becomes more restful, because it means that contribution does not require perfection. It does not require total control. It does not require uninterrupted success. It requires participation in a process larger than oneself. Tesla participated deeply, sometimes ahead of alignment, sometimes perfectly timed, sometimes misaligned. But he participated, and the current kept moving. If you imagine the Earth at night from space, cities glowing softly across continents, you are seeing a network of systems layered over more than a century. Embedded within that network are principles he helped articulate. No spotlight marks them. They simply function, and perhaps that is the most fitting tribute to a man who understood oscillation better than most. His legacy is not a flash in the sky. It is a steady grid beneath the horizon, back and forth, quietly, enduring. And as the grid beneath the horizon continues its soft and obedient humming, there is one more layer of stillness we can settle into. Because if we are honest, gently, calmly honest, the reason the lightning version of Tesla persists is not because it is accurate. It is because it is satisfying. We prefer stories where genius is obvious, where the misunderstood hero is vindicated dramatically, where the world eventually apologizes with applause and dramatic orchestral swells. But history rarely apologizes. It recalibrates. Tesla did not receive a grand public reversal of fortune in his lifetime. There was no final scene where the industrial world gathered to acknowledge its oversight. There was no triumphant financial restoration, no restored tower, no closing speech delivered from a podium surrounded by flashing lights. There was only continuity. The work he had done remained useful. The systems he had improved remained operational. The principles he had clarified remained foundational. And that may be more meaningful than applause. Applause fades quickly. Infrastructure does not. The alternating current system did not care whether Tesla was celebrated or forgotten. It operated according to physics. Motors turned because rotating magnetic fields functioned as designed. Power transmitted because phase relationships were calculated correctly. Physics is indifferent to fame, and perhaps that indifference is calming, because it suggests that contribution at its deepest level is not about recognition. It is about function. Tesla functioned within his era as an engineer who expanded the boundaries of electrical understanding. Sometimes he overextended. Sometimes he aligned perfectly with industrial need. Sometimes he misjudged the economics. But the laws he worked with were stable, and stability is quieter than legend. When you strip away the theatrical framing, you see a man who lived through ordinary frustrations, delayed funding, professional disagreement, aging, isolation. You see someone who kept refining ideas despite diminishing public enthusiasm. You see someone who did not require a storm to keep thinking. There is something profoundly gentle about that image, a mind continuing its oscillation, back and forth, Idea and revision, vision and recalculation, optimism and constraint, alternating. The lightning version tells us that greatness must flash to be real. The quiet version tells us that greatness can hum, and humming is sustainable. If Tesla had only been lightning, he would have been brief and spectacular and gone. But because he worked in currents, in sustained oscillations, his influence integrated into the fabric of modern life, not loudly, not theatrically, but reliably. And perhaps, as we let the room grow dim and the city's distant glow soften outside the window, we can appreciate the calm truth hidden beneath the myth. The world changes not through constant explosions of brilliance, but through systems that endure after the sparks have disappeared. Tesla's life, without lightning, becomes less about drama and more about durability, less about spectacle and more about structure, less about being seen and more about continuing. And with that steady current still moving quietly through the walls around us, we can allow the story to slow almost to stillness. No thunderclap, no applause, just the soft, persistent hum of history doing what it always does, enduring. And if we allow even that hum to soften, almost to the edge of silence, there is something final to notice. Tesla's life does not resolve neatly. There is no clean arc where struggle transforms into stable prosperity, no closing chapter where the world aligns perfectly with his vision. Instead, there is continuation and then absence. After his death, others organized his papers, others interpreted his unfinished proposals, others debated what he had meant, what he had solved, what he had almost solved. He was no longer present to clarify. And that is another quiet truth about innovation. The originator rarely controls the legacy. Ideas move on without their creators. They are adapted, reframed, scaled, sometimes misunderstood. They enter textbooks. They enter patents. They enter product designs. They stop being personal. Tesla's alternating current system stopped being Tesla's idea and became simply the grid. His motor became standard industrial architecture. His theoretical explorations became reference points. His name, meanwhile, drifted in and out of prominence across decades. There were periods when he was scarcely mentioned, periods when Edison overshadowed him, periods when niche engineering communities remembered him more vividly than the public did, and then slowly, cultural memory rediscovered him. But the grid had been humming all along. This is perhaps the most calming realization of all. Recognition is variable. Contribution, when embedded in systems, is steady. If Tesla could see modern cities glowing at night, he might not see monuments to himself. He would see transmission lines, substations, transformers stepping voltage up and down, motors turning reliably in factories and homes. He would likely focus not on whether he was credited, but on whether the system functioned efficiently, because that is what he cared about: efficiency, transmission, resonance, alignment, not lightning. Lightning was spectacle. Current was purpose. And so, when we remove the lightning from his story, we do not reduce it. We refine it. We see a disciplined engineer with unusual imagination. We see someone occasionally misaligned with market timing. We see persistence without constant validation. We see a life that felt uncertain in real time and foundational in retrospect. And perhaps that is the gentlest lesson to carry into the quiet. History rarely feels significant while it is happening. It feels administrative, repetitive, financially constrained, slightly uncertain. Only later does it glow. Tesla lived inside the administrative version. We inherit the illuminated one, and now, as the current continues its soft oscillation, back and forth, we can let the story settle completely. No final flash, no dramatic crescendo, just the steady awareness that progress is quieter than we imagine. And somewhere, in a city powered by alternating current, the hum continues, endlessly, gently, alternating. And if we let even that gentle oscillation fade into something softer still, we arrive at the quietest conclusion of all. Tesla's life, when stripped of lightning, becomes less about electricity and more about rhythm. A rhythm of attempt and revision, a rhythm of expansion and contraction, a rhythm of recognition and obscurity, back and forth, alternating. He did not live inside a permanent spotlight. He lived inside cycles, moments of alignment, followed by periods of strain, breakthroughs, followed by financial recalculations, public admiration, followed by long stretches of relative invisibility. And yet the thinking continued. There is something deeply calming about realizing that even history's great geniuses operated inside uncertainty. Tesla did not know which of his ideas would endure. He did not know which projects would collapse. He did not know how he would be remembered. He worked anyway, not because he was certain of legacy, but because he was certain of curiosity. That is a quieter motivation. The mythology tells us he was betrayed, overshadowed, misunderstood by a world that failed to see his brilliance. The calmer version suggests something less dramatic and more universal. The world simply moved according to economic forces, industrial timing, and practical constraints. Sometimes he aligned with them. Sometimes he did not. The grid that powers modern life is not built from myth. It is built from coordination. Standards committees, engineers, manufacturers, regulators, Tesla's contributions entered that network and became structural. He did not need to stand at the center of it forever. In fact, perhaps the greatest measure of impact is when a contribution becomes so integrated that it no longer requires the originator's presence. Alternating current does not introduce itself before flowing. It simply moves. Motors do not announce their inventor before turning. They simply rotate. Infrastructure does not recite history before functioning. It simply hums. And so Tesla's life resolves not in spectacle, but in integration. His work became part of something larger than him. His name became optional. The current remained. If you listen carefully now to the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint buzz in the wall, the distant glow of streetlights, you are hearing a system that has outlived its origin stories. No thunder, no dramatic duel, just electrons shifting direction 50 or 60 times per second, depending on where you are in the world. Back and forth, alternating, and perhaps that is the most restful way to remember him. Not as a storm, not as a martyr, not as a lightning bolt frozen in midair, but as a steady mind that helped shape the rhythm of the modern world, even when his own life felt uneven. The boring Tesla story is not a diminished one. It is simply a quieter truth. A truth that suggests lasting impact does not need to flash. It only needs to endure. And with that steady hum still moving invisibly around us, we can finally let the room grow completely still. No sparks, no applause, just quiet history, continuing gently in the dark. And even in the dark, when the hum feels almost imaginary, there is still something worth noticing. Tesla never saw himself as a character in a story. He saw problems, transmission loss, inefficient motors, signal degradation. He approached the world not as a stage, but as a system slightly out of tune. And when you look at his life through that lens, the disappointments feel less theatrical and more procedural. A system misaligned, a parameter off, a projection too optimistic, a variable underestimated. He was constantly tuning. That is what engineers do. They do not wait for lightning. They adjust frequency. Tesla adjusted frequency. He experimented with resonance, with oscillation, with how energy could move more smoothly between points. His intellectual language was one of balance and alignment. And perhaps that language describes his life more accurately than myth ever could. There were moments when he was in phase with the world, alternating current at exactly the right industrial moment. Niagara Falls, converting kinetic force into electrical distribution. Cities expanding rapidly enough to require his solutions. Then there were moments when he drifted slightly out of phase. Wireless global energy before the economic grid was ready to support it. Grand planetary concepts inside narrow funding channels, in phase, out of phase, alternating. And that oscillation is not failure, it is motion. It is easy to assume that history belongs only to those who remain permanently in phase with their era. But often, those slightly ahead create the blueprint that others later align with. Tesla sketched blueprints the world would slowly grow into. He did not live to see full synchronization, but synchronization eventually arrived, not with applause, not with retroactive wealth, but with infrastructure. If he could stand quietly in a modern control room, walls of monitors displaying grid stability, voltage regulation, frequency control, he might not smile dramatically. He might simply nod. The system is stable. The oscillation is controlled. The energy flows efficiently across distance. That would be enough. And perhaps that is the final calming recalibration of his story. He was not a lightning bolt striking history once. He was part of the circuitry, part of the tuning process, part of the slow calibration of a planet learning how to distribute power. When we remove the lightning, we see not a diminished figure, but a more integrated one, a mind adjusting variables, a life oscillating between recognition and obscurity, a legacy embedded in systems that no longer require his presence to function. And as we let even that thought settle, we notice something gentle. The most powerful forces in history are not the loudest. They are the most stable, back and forth, alternating. And with that steady rhythm continuing invisibly all around us, we can rest. No sparks, no thunder, just the quiet persistence of current and the quiet persistence of a man who helped shape it. And now, as the rhythm slows even further, we can consider something almost paradoxical. Tesla's life feels dramatic when summarized, but it felt incremental when lived. When historians compress decades into paragraphs, it sounds like a sequence of grand turns. Europe to America, Edison to alternating current, triumph to isolation, tower to collapse, genius to myth. But inside each of those turns were thousands of small days, days of correspondence, days of recalculating, days of waiting for investors to reply, days of adjusting coils, rechecking voltages, drafting diagrams again. History condenses, life expands, and the expanded version is always quieter. Tesla likely did not experience his life as the war of currents. He experienced it as engineering disagreements, strategic decisions, business negotiations. He likely did not experience Wardenclyffe as the tragic collapse of a dream. He experienced it as funding shortfalls, construction delays, investor hesitations. The drama comes later. In real time, there is mostly maintenance, and maintenance is deeply unglamorous. The electrical grid, which now defines modern civilization, requires constant adjustment. Frequency regulation, load balancing, redundancy planning. It is not a one-time invention, it is a continuous process. Tesla's intellectual life mirrored that structure. He did not invent once and rest. He adjusted continuously. Even his so-called eccentricities, the precision with numbers, the careful habits, suggest a mind that craved order in systems, a mind uncomfortable with inefficiency. Perhaps that same precision made financial improvisation more difficult for him. Investors operate in probabilistic tolerance. Engineers often prefer defined parameters. When those worlds misalign, friction occurs. But friction does not negate contribution. It simply adds texture. If you imagine Tesla standing alone at night, not in a laboratory crackling with theatrical arcs, but in a modest room with papers spread across a desk, you see something more durable than lightning. You see continuity of thought, and continuity is what built the world that followed. Alternating current did not win because it was romantic. It won because it scaled better across distance, because it minimized loss, because it adapted to expanding urban infrastructure, engineering decisions, not drama. Even the famous demonstrations lighting up the Chicago World's Fair were proof of concept, not performance art. They were validations of scalability, and scalability is rarely loud. It is stable. The boring Tesla story reminds us that the most transformative forces are not spectacular in daily practice. They are methodical, back and forth, alternating. The mythology turns him into a lightning bolt striking once. The quiet version shows him as part of a system that required constant calibration. He did not live inside applause. He lived inside iteration. And iteration, though rarely celebrated, is what endures. As the room grows even dimmer now, and the hum feels almost like memory rather than sound, we can rest inside that realization. Greatness is not always explosive. Sometimes it is simply persistent, and persistence, like alternating current, moves steadily between poles, adjusting, correcting, sustaining, no thunder, no crescendo, just the quiet maintenance of a world still powered by principles he helped refine. And if we allow even maintenance to fade into the background, there is one last layer of calm to notice. Tesla's story, without lightning, becomes less about achievement and more about proportion. He was brilliant, he was flawed, he was visionary, he was impractical at times. None of these cancel the others. Myth prefers extremes. The quiet version accepts balance. He did not invent electricity. He refined how it could be distributed. He did not single-handedly electrify the world. He contributed essential pieces. He did not fail completely. He did not triumph completely. He oscillated back and forth, recognition and obscurity, alignment and misalignment, precision and overreach. And perhaps that oscillation is the most honest shape of a human life. It is tempting to imagine that history moves in straight lines, upward arcs of success or downward spirals of tragedy. But Tesla's life looks more like a waveform, peaks, troughs, return to center, peaks again. His early successes with alternating current were real and measurable. His later financial struggles were also real and measurable. Both belong in the same story. The lightning version edits out the troughs. The cynical version edits out the peaks. The quiet version allows both. And when both are allowed, something restful happens. The pressure to categorize disappears. He does not need to be a saint of science or a martyr of industry. He can simply be an engineer who worked intensely on problems that mattered. He can be someone who sometimes misjudged scale and sometimes predicted it correctly. He can be someone whose ideas outlived his comfort. The grid that surrounds us today, stable, regulated, humming, is built on balance. Frequency must remain steady. Voltage must remain within range. Systems must oscillate predictably. Tesla understood oscillation deeply, mathematically. His life mirrored it unintentionally. Perhaps that is why the quiet version feels fitting, because it removes exaggeration and leaves proportion. A life neither purely triumphant nor purely tragic. A mind neither perfectly aligned with its era nor entirely abandoned by it. A legacy neither instant nor absent, but gradually integrated. And as we near the end, there is something deeply calming about integration. When an idea becomes infrastructure, it no longer requires defense. It no longer requires myth. It simply functions. Tesla's contributions function, not loudly, not theatrically, but steadily. If you turn your attention to the subtle sounds in your room right now, the faint electrical buzz, the distant hum of appliances, you are listening to the outcome of countless engineers adjusting parameters across generations. Tesla was one of them. Not the only one, not the last one, but one whose oscillations helped tune the system. And now, as even the hum softens toward stillness, we can let the waveform settle gently back to center. No lightning bolt frozen in the sky. Just balance, just continuity, just the quiet endurance of current moving back and forth, long after the sparks have faded. And as the waveform settles closer to center, there is only one final observation left, and it is the softest of all. Tesla's story feels complete only because we are looking backward. When he was alive, nothing felt complete. There was always another calculation, another proposal, another improvement waiting to be tested. He did not experience a final chapter with neat conclusions. He experienced continuation until there was no more time to continue. That is how most lives unfold. We rarely know which effort will matter most. We rarely know which idea will endure. We rarely know whether recognition will arrive early, late, or never. Tesla did not know that alternating current would become the backbone of modern civilization. He hoped, he argued, he demonstrated, but certainty belongs to hindsight, not to the present. The quiet version of his story accepts that uncertainty as central rather than tragic. He worked inside it. He navigated fluctuating support, fluctuating reputation, fluctuating finances. And yet, the equations remained steady. Frequency remained measurable. Phase remained calculable. Resonance remained predictable. There is comfort in that stability, even when human circumstances feel unstable. Perhaps that is why the metaphor of alternating current fits so gently here. It does not surge permanently in one direction. It moves back and forth. It balances opposing poles. It maintains equilibrium through oscillation. Tesla's life oscillated. Success and strain. Visibility and obscurity. Optimism and disappointment. But the oscillation itself never stopped. He remained intellectually active, curious, engaged with the physics that fascinated him. The lightning myth suggests a single dramatic arc, a bolt that strikes once and defines everything. The quiet version suggests something more enduring, a steady flow of thought that continued regardless of applause. And when applause faded, the thought remained. That may be the most calming truth hidden beneath the spectacle, because it means that contribution does not depend on constant recognition. It depends on sustained engagement with what matters. Tesla engaged deeply with electromagnetic systems. He tuned them, improved them, imagined them scaled beyond what was practical in his lifetime. The world eventually caught up, partially, imperfectly, collaboratively, and now, as cities glow gently in the distance and the grid hums beneath our awareness, his life no longer feels dramatic. It feels integrated, like current in a wire, present, unseen, essential, back and forth, back and forth. And with that steady oscillation carrying on invisibly around us, there is almost nothing left to add, just quiet continuity, just the gentle reminder that history's most lasting forces rarely flash. They hum and they endure. And now, finally, we let even the hum dissolve into something softer than sound. Because at the very end of the Tesla story, without the lightning bolts, there is no revelation waiting, no hidden document that changes everything, no final surge of recognition that reorders the past. There is only perspective. When we remove the thunder, we see proportion. When we remove the sparks, we see structure. When we remove the rivalry, we see systems. Tesla was not a storm passing over history. He was part of the circuitry that history slowly assembled. He worked inside constraints. He made errors in judgment. He refined extraordinary ideas. He misjudged timing. He persisted anyway, and perhaps that is enough. It is easy to imagine that meaningful lives must climax, that they must crescendo into applause. But infrastructure does not crescendo. It stabilizes. Alternating current does not build to a final dramatic burst. It maintains rhythm, back and forth, 50 or 60 times per second, depending on where you are in the world. So steady that we forget it is happening at all. That is Tesla's real monument, not a statue, not a myth, not a lightning bolt frozen against a dark sky, but a stabilized frequency, a tuned system, a grid that moves energy quietly across distance, indifferent to fame, indifferent to narrative. He did not control the entire system. No one does. He contributed to its calibration, and calibration is rarely glamorous. It is careful, measured, patient. In the end, the boring Tesla story is not disappointing. It is grounding. It tells us that progress is rarely explosive. It is iterative. It tells us that influence may not feel dramatic while it is unfolding. It may feel administrative, constrained, occasionally frustrating. Only later does it glow. Tesla lived the administrative version. We inherit the illuminated one. And now, as we let the final current settle back toward silence, there is nothing left to dramatize. No thunder, no spectacle. Just the quiet understanding that the modern world hums on principles refined by many hands, one of them belonging to a tall, meticulous engineer who preferred equations to applause. Back and forth, alternating. And with that steady rhythm continuing invisibly all around us, we can let the lights dim completely. Quiet history for sleep.